What's up, everybody, and welcome to the Veilcast episode number 4. And this week we are talking about the stat system in Camelot Unchained. It's a little bit different, in some ways a lot different. And joining me, as always, Velik and Alistair. Velik, how you doing today?
I am doing good.
Doing good? You just barely made it from work. Thank you for joining us. We didn't want to do it without you. Alistair, how you doing? Can't hear you at all. He can't even. He's doing terrible.
There we go.
There he is.
I'm doing great. Aside from the fact that, on Monday, as you guys know, I had this surgery on my eyes to fix the lazy eye. So the procedure basically consists of removing my eyeballs, tweaking with the muscles, and then putting them back in place again.
Don't tell me
so
that.
It looked like I came out of the Walking Dead cast because my eyes are dead. Don't bother, guys. Guys watching the stream, it's healing. It's going to be fine in a week or so. But, at least I can scare people on the street. I'm like, give me your money. And then they're like, okay.
That would be the worst thing.
Commitment to the cast.
Oh, my
goodness. This is due to heavy drug usage. Kids, don't use drugs,
Don't. That's horrible. No, don't ever. If you're abducted by aliens, leave my eyeballs alone. That'd be horrible.
Yeah, so I won't be looking directly at the camera because I don't want to freak you guys out.
Just don't put your eye up to the camera.
Yeah, exactly. It's not because I'm avoiding you guys. I love you guys, at the chat there. But I just...
All right, let's move on. I've scary eyeball. We are talking about stats today, and stats, it kind of seems like, I don't know, maybe not that exciting of a system, right? It's not... But there's actually a lot of stuff in here that we can talk about, a lot of stuff to learn, and in some ways a lot different than other games. I think is going to be sort of a shock to some people. Let's start off with, we're going to watch a part of the first video for their BSE, and then we're just going to talk about it. We just got this one clip. Let's check this part out.
So first we have the primary stats. Then we have the secondary stats, and then the derived stats. Want to explain to the guys and gals listening what that is?
Okay, so primary stats are stats in the way that people are probably most familiar with them. It's stats that increase over time. If you're looking at some of the older games, Ultima Online, where your stats increase with use of the specific stat that you're focusing on, or in the case of skills work in a similar way. But just focusing on stats, you get stronger by doing things that require strength. And so that system feeds back onto itself. So if you want to do something that requires more strength, you'd use something that uses and requires strength. And so that system allows you to build your character in a way that you kind of focus in areas and you kind of min-max, as we like to say, where you have a specific thing that you're really concerned about and that you can take actions that focus around that and progress your character in that direction. And you don't just progress and advance in a linear, standardized, XP-based way where you just level up and everything gets better. You only get better at the things that you care about.
And I think that for me was the key. When I first proposed this system internally and talked about it with the guys and even talked about it in on the foundational principles, I wanted it to be, and I still want it to be, obviously, a system where it's more logical, even in a magical world with dragons and all sorts of wonderful things floating around here. And I think a system where if you are a fighter and you're getting stronger every day by using a sword, to me that's logical, it's more immersive, and it works. It's very easy to understand versus, the standard, I'm going to kill 1,000 rats and now I get to take points, and even though I never used this ability, I can now put them towards an ability.
Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of where we are with primary stats. And then we have secondary stats, which are in a lot of ways very similar. They do a lot of the similar things, but they don't progress. And that's really the only real distinction, as far as I remember, that there is between these things, is that primary stats progress over time. You can get better at them. You can get worse at them. They can decay if you don't keep things up. But secondary stats kind of just are the way they are from the point that you start your character off. That's not to say that they can't change. Things like the mass of your character. If you're a giant, you might grow, your mass might increase. But that's not a primary stat. You can't use that to get better at it. It's something that is only changed by effects of the game world and effects over time, not by usage.
Exactly. And my thinking on that was that by not allowing it to change, we allow people, some would say we force people, to make decisions about where they're going to allocate points. Because we should probably say, because we really didn't say it yet, that we are going to use, a fairly common, point allocation system where you're going to start with a large amount of points to allocate to the various, stats that you have. And at least with the secondary stats, and we all know anyone out there who's a min-maxer or who's played any of these games, they can do a bit of a cost-benefit analysis where they go, well, I won't put points in this now because I know I'll be able to level those up. Instead, I'll use those points on something else. In this case, these are stats that you're pretty much, obviously other than, for example, the Giants growing, you're stuck with. And you're going to have to make that decision early on.
And that character creation, you have boons and banes there. So basically, it's the advantage and disadvantage system that we see on so many pen and paper RPGs, right? Where you kind of pick some disadvantages, and then they give you a few points that you can use to buy advantages. So that's a very common system in any pen and paper RPG. But on computer RPGs, it hasn't been used in MMOs. So I think it's fairly simple and great, to be honest. But it's gonna take a lot to understand everything. Look at the amount of variables. Each one of those little squares is one boon and one bane, and each one of them gives you something or takes away something, and you can put 1, 2, 3 points on each, or none. And wow, it's so many combinations, so much stuff to balance. Obviously, this is not final. I mean, there's a lot of tweaking there is gonna go.
Right.
But yeah, I'm excited to just see what kind of discussions will spring from all this amount of option when creating your character. And this is permanent choice. You make it, and you can't tweak again.
Yeah.
Velik, are you a min-maxer? Are you a big number guy?
Yes and no.
Yes and no.
I'll say no by default because I'm not really huge into making sure I get it absolutely min-maxed. I want the absolute highest amount of benefit I can in whatever I'm focusing on doing, because I tend to be a bit more of an RPer. I like to work in a certain degree of RP flair and everything in there. And I tend to, which is one reason I am a little bit worried about the system and how permanent choices are, because I do like to experiment. Like, I like to go out there and go, well, nobody else is doing this kind of build, and it sounds interesting to me, so I'm going to go with it. And then if I go with it and it ends up being terrible, that's a problem.
Right, yeah.
But
it could take a long time, too. It might take you a year to find out that it's not any good.
Yeah, 6 months later, I go, oh, man, my build is crap.
Right.
Such a casual.
Yeah, and there's so many stats on here. I mean, let me pull it up here. Like you guys were talking about, on the left-hand side of the screen are banes and boons. I mean, and before we even get into that stuff, on the right-hand side shows all the stats. Like they were talking about primary stats, your strength, your dexterity, your will, your resonance, your vitality, agility, attunement, faith, eyesight, endurance. I mean, there's so many things there. And then secondary stats, clarity, hearing, presence, mass. Those are things like how big your character is, how well you could maybe hear people. And then lastly, derived stats is like, the culmination of everything together, what you have. I mean, what is it? ESO, playing ESO, I think there's 3 stats? 4 stats? I mean, there's 5 stats. I mean, there's not even any you can really change.
It's overly simplified, yes.
Yeah, everything has just gotten more and more and more simplified. And like you said, Alistair, this is back to like pen and paper game. I'm excited about it, right? And there's a lot of min and maxers who are probably super excited about this, right? This is heaven for them.
It is, and to be honest, it fixes a lot of the nature of all of this, the nature of all they talked about, fixes a lot of problems we've been seeing on recent MMOs. They become a non-issue, to be honest. Because, for example, if you have been playing WoW over the years, or any MMO that has sustained, like Rift and games that stay for a long time, but mainly WoW, they do this a lot in World of Warcraft, where they completely revamp the entire stat systems, the entire itemization, everything, every expansion. They change the hit, this expansion DPS has to max hit rating. The next expansion, there's no such thing as hit rating. You just hit everything, and now there's no spell power or healing power anymore. It's just power. I mean, they keep changing, and then suddenly spell power and healing power comes back. The reason why they keep doing this is because it's pretty much impossible to balance something that has a base and then the gear upgrades on it. And then you have to keep generating new content and making the characters more powerful without making all the skills, go in this spinning tendency of just getting too overpowered or not scaling very well or scaling too well. So you got to, always be tweaking the base damage, then tweak the cost, and tweak the gear, and tweak the formula that calculates. Well, it's such a nightmare. And then what players end up doing, is it becomes a chore to actually make your gear set. You're like, okay, now I got to max level. How am I, what kind of gear do I have to use? And then you're like, okay, hit rating first, gotta get it to 500. Then I have to get this
Right.
percentage of crit, blah, blah, blah. This becomes a chore, and then they end up just removing it because everybody is annoyed by having to pay attention to all these stats. But if you put that on the character creation like Camelot Unchained is doing, then you have to worry about it once. And then after it's done, you kind of have to just go with it, and see how you're better going to complement your stats. So, you're a warrior, I'm a warrior, but your allocation on the stats is completely different from mine. So our itemization is different. What you have to get, I don't,
Let's talk about that a little bit. You said that you only have to worry about it once. I think there's a big distinction that we haven't really talked about yet between Camelot Unchained and other MMOs like World of Warcraft.
Yes.
Most MMOs right now have these stats on items. You get a pair of gloves and they give you 50 strength, and now somehow you're stronger and you can swing your sword harder and you do more damage. None of that's going to happen on Camelot Unchained. Items, it's almost the reverse, where before it was like you get items and they make you stronger. Here, you can't even use some items unless you're strong enough. Unless you have enough strength to lift that two-handed sword, you can't even pick that up. You might be able to use a different two-handed sword, maybe one for little kids or something, but you have to be strong enough. And while you're doing these things, while you're using your weapons and playing the game, it could increase your strength. So maybe use a little sword to begin with. You play a little while, you get stronger, you can use a bigger sword and bigger sword. This seems like something pretty big. I mean, every game does it. Almost every MMO out there, you get items, it has stats. That's how I know this item is better. This is a huge change, right? Velek,
Yes.
what do you think?
I think this is absolutely one of the coolest things about the game, actually. Even though, you look at stats and they're kind of, it's numbers, so it's sometimes kind of hard to get super excited about it. I like numbers. And one of the things I have traditionally really gotten annoyed by in a lot of MMOs are the items with the stats on them. I mean, my bracers give me plus 500 strength. And it gets ridiculous, too, like in World of Warcraft now, where items give you plus 500 of all kinds of stats and stuff. And you're just like, wow, really? 500 of the scaling? As someone mentioned, who was it that mentioned in chat? Hoodster mentioned the problems of scaling. The scaling, you start off as level 1 with like plus 10 strength. You're like, yeah, plus 10 strength. By the time you're max level, you're like, I just got a shoelace that gives me plus 500 strength and whatever.
Right.
And it is the reverse. I mean, they take all the stat bonuses off the items. Instead, they make the items require a certain stat to use them. And then you have to keep using basically the best that you can use in order to level up that stat so that you can get better equipment. If you're using, subpar gear, you're not going to level up as fast, or you may not level up at all. So you have to keep going back to the crafter and going, okay, my strength has gone up. I now need a bigger sword.
Yeah, and
while-
it might not even be bigger. It might just be from a different material, right? Which is heavier. So you have a different material which is heavier and does more damage. So you got to level up with a lighter material until the crafter can make you an iron sword that's going to have more damage potential and be more, heavier. So you need more strength.
Yeah, and I think the really important part of this is that, like you said, it doesn't have stat bonuses. So the sword doesn't go, you have plus 50 strength, which now makes you do more damage. Instead, the sword goes, I do 50 damage, and you require 50 strength that you wield me. So your stat does still determine your damage in an indirect fashion. It doesn't directly say you have X strength, so therefore you do X bonus damage like a lot of MMOs do. Instead, you have to have X stat in order to wield a weapon which does this much damage. Which I think still makes your stats really important, but it also goes back to re-emphasizing the crafters and making them an integral part of the system.
And replaces the level requirements that you have on other games. This game has no levels. So, something has to limit what you can use. You can't just pop into the game day one and then grab the legendary absurd sword and use it as efficiently as a guy who has been in the game for a year. That
if your character isn't strong enough, what if you make like a giant that's really strong though? He can come in day one, use a really big, heavy, super strong sword. He can basically negate all those problems because he's strong enough to use it. Is that going to cause any problems with balance, do you think? Is there going to be people saying, don't make this class because it takes you 6 months to get strong enough to do what you want, or this race? Is that just a bonus of being... Because there's some of these stats too. If we look on here, they were talking about secondary stats like mass that doesn't really change. Like you're just stuck with what you're stuck with. But then they also talked about how there's some, maybe like the giants, who can grow and get bigger. What do you guys think about... these are stats that we haven't seen. Look at this stuff. Clarity, presence, mass. This game is going to have physics where you can push people around. And there's so many stats on here. And they even talked about, how do you guys feel about the stats that they said that aren't going to be useful for any classes? So there's going to be some that you don't need at all. And that's kind of why new games have pared it down.
The secondary stats, right? You're talking about. Because the clarity, all those are secondary, right? So yeah, those are stats are like, like if you're carrying a bunch of stuff, then you probably will have more mass, because you're heavier. Maybe if you use certain sets of heavy armor, then you're going to gain mass because, you're just heavy armor. Even if you're a smaller character, you're using a heavy armor. Obviously, you might not have as much mass as a giant, but you still have more mass than the dude that is wearing pajamas, right? So...
And what about the stats that they said are going to be useless, though? They said there's some classes that just don't need these certain stats. They're just going to be useless stats. That's why I think new games have kind of made it simpler and pared it down, is so you don't have this list of stats that are pointless. You get, and most games, like, you get an item and it has the stats on it. We don't have to worry about that here. But what about when I look at my character screen and I see this stat that's completely useless? I don't need it at all. It's pointless. Like, why even?
I think that's fine, really. Because there's so many stats in there, and like the primary stats, they only grow through use. So they're only growing when you're using them. So there's going to be tons of primary stats that you're really going to have like very low or no ranks in. And I think that's perfectly fine. You'll just see them there and go, oh, well, that's the mage stat. And I think there are still current MMOs that have that in there as well. Most of them do. You can still see your intelligence score. You may not care about it at all, but most of them still have it in there, and you just ignore it. And I think it'll be the same thing with the secondary stats. One thing I did notice with the secondary stats that I like is I think it's cool that you have to pick them at the beginning. You really have to pick what kind of points and how you want to distribute them. You have to make that decision early on because you can't actively change it. But I did notice that the secondary stats are mostly things that aren't necessarily going to cripple your character, like presence was mentioned as somehow having something to do with how NPCs interact with you. And I was like, what is that? There are no it's not like a PvE based game, so what even is that? I don't know.
Yeah,
but you could probably get around without it if you don't put many points in it.
Yeah, I remember it was something about being it was something about being a long time on fight. So if you have a lot of presence, you kind of inspire people around you. I don't know if that's going to be like a little aura that gives people buffs. If you're a melee,
it says on the website here that it affects how NPCs react to player character, as well as the effectiveness of certain abilities. So again, like you guys are talking about, there basically are no NPCs that we really know about. There are some in the world, like monsters and things you can kill for resources and stuff. So what if you have a lot of presence? They'll just leave you alone, or maybe they're friendly. And then I guess this is my point. Like, this specifically says presence affects certain abilities. You have other abilities like willpower, right? And then faith. And then, so why have, just hypothetically, because we don't know how this is going to work, but why would you have one class who uses willpower for their spells, another one who uses faith for those spells.
Yeah, like the cleric and the mage.
Yeah,
right?
and then someone else uses intelligence for their spells, and then someone else uses wisdom. Why have 3 or 4 different things that all do the same thing? Why do they need a different name? Why does it have to be different for different characters? I mean, isn't there a reason why? I mean, games haven't been doing it just to make it dumber. It's easier. It makes more sense when there's one, right?
It makes more sense, but then choices don't matter. It's all the same.
Yeah, I think it's important to have it that way because I think what their goal is to spread variety. Like presence, I would just guessing, I don't know, but presence, I would assume maybe that's a secondary stat that filters into bards, and maybe they have certain types of abilities that are like crowd control or inspirational abilities that they can use that presence will go in effect. But then maybe they don't want presence to necessarily do the same thing for a mage. So they don't want to encourage. Maybe mages have an ability that might be of the same sort of type of some of those abilities, but they don't want them to necessarily get the benefit from presence so that they could be as good at doing that as a bard could be. So in that way, they can just say, okay, presence does this for the bard abilities, doesn't do it for their abilities, so the bards can get the presence bonus if they want to focus in that and be better than the mage can be in that.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I'm thinking anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I like options, and I agree. In general, most games have dumbed it down where it's so boring you don't even care. But you can also get to a point where, I mean, again, look at this stat screen. There's 30 things on there. Like, I'm all for numbers. And I like number crunching, and I like min-maxing. But there comes a point where there's so much stuff that it's cluttered and convoluted and annoying, and you're like, just tell me what I want to know. Stop giving me all this junk, right?
Well, that's not the niche that Camelot Unchained is designed for, man. You know, like it's you're supposed to have to pay attention to what you're doing. Otherwise, the choices are going to kill you. You know.
Well, and this is where I think is their other strength in this is because they have come out and said we're giving you the formulas. We're telling you exactly what these things do. We don't know right now what they do, but they're going to come out and tell us exactly what the point values are for all these things. So that we don't go into it blind, we can go into it and say, okay, this trait does X for these things. So we can plan it out and know ahead of time. And I think that's what it's going to take. I agree with you. There's a bit of work there because it's going to take that going into it. You're really going to have to look at the stats and kind of know what you want to do with them. You can't just wing it.
Yeah, I mean that's a problem that I mentioned in the beginning, which is not only the MMOs these days have all these stats that are on gear, like we were talking about, plus 500 to strength on the brace or something. So that's hard to scale with the base abilities. But they also have to balance PvP and PvE together, right? So if an ability is doing too much damage on PvE or on PvP, then sometimes they cannot tweak it down a little bit, because if they do, then the DPS on PvE is gonna just go down to the point where players are going to be complaining. So there's all of this impossible thing to do, which is to balance rating rotations where people are basically sitting on a spot, maximizing their damage, with the PvP environment where rotations don't really play a role. I mean, you just have people fighting, and then there are skills that you use at determining moments and certain areas. So it's more like CC utility and using your skills at the right time and positioning. There's no guarantee that the guy's just going to stand there and take your hits like you have in scripted PvE content. So this game has no scripted PvE content. I mean, it might have, but it's not relevant to progression. It's not main part of the game. This game is you develop things through PvP by killing people. So PvP are the fights that actually matter. So, I think Camelot Unchained starts with an advantage just because they don't have that worry of balancing PvP and PvE. It's just PvP, and if things are getting out of hand, they can go back to those primary stats and see how that is influencing all damage and just work on that. They don't have to rebalance the gear. They don't have to, but what about the next tier of gear? What we're going to do about, no, they just have to look at the base, and every time they're designing a new material so that crafters can create new stuff for us, they can, keep following the same pattern. And in case one or a material or another does too much damage or gives too much armor when you design armor from it, they can just tweak that material. And then, it doesn't affect anything else. The big problem of current MMOs is that, you tweak the base damage of this ability, And now this ability does less damage, but all the others keep doing the same damage. And then the next tier, you're going to have to tweak all the others too, because now the scaling screwed up, other abilities. So it's a never, it reoccurs. It's a problem that never goes away, right? So Camelot Unchained doesn't have any of that, which is awesome in my opinion.
Yeah, someone said in chat just a moment ago, any of these stats, you were talking about crafters, I didn't see any of these stats that affect crafters, right? Like, if they're stronger, they can make things faster, or, I mean, maybe I guess they could carry more, which would be good, because they got to go out and, like, build siege engines, right? What about crafters? Because crafters are supposed to be a huge part of this game. Do they care about stats at all, you think? For themselves?
I think they'll have to. I mean, because the game has stats. So if the crafters don't have to worry about stats at all, then I think that would be problematic based on the entire concept of the game. Choice matters. Well, if the crafters don't have to make any choices for that, that's kind of silly. So I think the stats would definitely matter for them because they're supposed to be a crafter class, and they haven't made the crafter class yet. I mean, I think they're working on it. I don't know what the status is exactly on it, but I know, it's not out there. It's not official yet. So I'm assuming that might be why we don't know for sure which stats are going to go with them. But there are some stats I could speculate might go into them, and it may be different types of crafting. And I definitely think that's going to be something that will feature in there once they have the exact idea of how they want the crafter class to really work nailed down.
Yeah, I think we talked at last episode that crafting is magic, right? So a lot of the stats that influence magic, like willpower and all of that could also factor into crafting. We don't know yet. Obviously, I think that they might have other stats specifically for crafting, because it seems that they're doing stats for every specific thing. But we have to also keep in mind that this is early. So maybe, the problem you were mentioning before, where, willpower, faith, intelligence. I mean, willpower and intelligence are kind of interchangeable, right? You either use willpower and intelligence. Why calling it a different thing? I agree with you. It could get overcomplicated and unnecessary, but that's early. They're probably going to be testing things and then look at things and say, hey, we don't really need these two stats. We can just condense them on a single one, and that's not going to affect anything. But I think they're just starting with a bunch of stuff because they want to explore all the ideas that they had, and then the ones that they see are not working, they're going to start trimming off of the game as we test, I guess.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point that crafting is like magic, because some of those stats talk specifically about the veil and being able to use the veil, and then also making sure that you use it in the right way where it doesn't like blow up on you. So there's harnessing its power, but then also like making sure it's not a bad way. So you could have a crafter who does that. Maybe they can pull out really strong things out of the veil, but they have a high chance of it going wrong. Maybe you have someone that's really consistent. Their items just aren't quite as good. Or you could go the other way, because we talked about how everything's going to be siege weapons and all this stuff. Crafters need to be strong to hold that stuff to go out there. So you could have a crafter, you ask them, what do you spec into? Oh, I'm strength. So I can go out and set up siege weapons. Or this person, I'm spec'd into willpower, so I can do this sort of crafting. So it could open up a lot of options for them as well.
Yeah, I think similar to I've been playing Star Wars, so I'm kind of influenced by that. But it's similar to the light and dark side thing on the Star Wars, where you have the dark side, which is raw power, but it's unstable. It corrupts people. It makes them crazy. It breaks their body. And then you have the light side, which is not as powerful in that sense, but it's stable. It's it's always the same. It doesn't completely destroy the person using it. It's more steady. So crafters could have that option, and even casters, right? I mean, any casters could have spells that are more powerful because they are reliable, and some that are more RNG based, where sometimes you just get a big boost from the veil and explode everybody, and sometimes it's gonna go like backfire, or right. Or just spend too much of your resource, like mana or whatever it is that they have as a resource. It's going to do the same thing, but it's going to burn your resource to the point where you can't use anything else. So, I mean, there's a lot of variables they can do. The veil is like, it's chaos. It's open for possibility. So
yeah, Velik, I see you looking there at your notes, your paper. What do you got down there?
I was actually thinking about the RVR, back at the PvP and how these stats are going to factor in. I think Alistair is completely right. I mean, that the entire system and how it's made simplifies balance. But I think there are also some aspects in there that are really interesting that they're putting in, really thinking about the RVR. Mainly, looking at like the derived stats. And one of my favorite things they have in there, the panic system. Which, if for people that haven't seen that part of the video, I guess, the panic system is their idea that if your side's losing, if all your allies are dying around you, depending on what sort of a panic rating you have, which is the derived stat that combines from your primary and secondary stats, then your character might either get stronger, to kind of rally up and fight harder, or might actually get some small penalties because you're basically kind of peeing your own pants and getting ready to run away.
All right.
Yeah.
And we just
the
lost the
stream's
video
down
again.
again. Yeah. Okay. Sucks. Okay. Well, it happens. I mean, it's bad luck.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of stats, lots of options, for all of that, for all the stats. I think it's nice to get back to older games where you have stat points when you make your character and you can pick who you want to be. Every human isn't the same. You got a strong one and you got a smart one, and it's not just based on who has gear. Because like you guys were talking about earlier, like you could just switch gear out and you have this whole min-maxing your gear and stuff. But if like, I want to be the strongest giant in the entire game, you can start that from the very beginning and put all your points into that and just be as strong as possible, and then go from there. And you don't worry about flavor of the month builds. Like, oh, this stat's really good, everybody jumps on that. Or, this... You can say, I've been the strongest giant from the beginning of the game. This is who I made my character to be. And you can be that forever, which is really nice.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it brings back a concept that I remember from when I started playing pen and paper RPGs, which is, just roll your stats, see what you have. And then with the stats that you have, you see what you're going to be. Which is different. You're like, okay, so I got a, D&D where, the highest stats is 18 and the lowest is like 8 or something, or 10. So, I have 2 18s, but then everything is like 10, 9, 11, 12. So maybe I should roll a warrior, because warriors just need strength and constitution, and everything else, be damned. But if you get a bunch of 14, 15, 16, 14, 15, then maybe you should roll a paladin or a monk, because they need to be balanced in D&D in this case, right? So, I mean, this game kind of brings back the concept where, I'm going to put this, and this, and look at my secondary stats, see what kind of, what kind of template I can come up with the base stats. And then after that's done, I'll see, I can really use this kind of stat allocation, booms and banes, on the mage. So I'm going to make a mage, right? And then you pick up the mage as a class, and then, that escalates. So obviously, in this game, you're going to choose the class before you make your character. You're going to make the character for the class. We know that. But, it brings that concept where first you have a person, and then that person is a potential good mage or a potential good cleric, or he's not a potential very good warrior. So you're not going to go warrior with that, So that's cool to me. That's just reinforcing the choices matter aspect. I plan to make a human female warrior, and I know that just by being female and by being human, I might not be the best warrior class. There will probably be a giant there that can wield a freaking gigantic sword and have much more mass and just push people. So I might not even be able to be a tank. Now I might be able to be an off tank, but not like in the front lines, facing giants. And I'm fine with that. I'm okay with that choice, because then I'll probably, it's probably going to be easier for me to increase my dexterity or whatever agility stats they have, and then I can complement my abilities with that kind of stuff and use weapons that favor that kind of abilities,
Yeah, to backtrack a little bit back to what Ziz was saying like ages ago, I guess going back to the tabletop analogy with the stats, that does kind of reinforce possibly a little bit about what he was saying about there being a ton of stats and it being really complicated, because while their ideas do come from tabletop, if you look at most tabletop games, the stat systems in those games are really simple. You pick them all ahead of time. You plan your stuff out. but the systems are really simple. They're very understandable. You know what the numbers are. You know exactly what they do. There aren't complex formulas. So it'll be interesting to see how they can have these complex formulas in there, but still make it understandable enough that we can make those choices with a good level of understanding ahead of time. Because I think that's the important part, is being able, for the average gamer, to be able to understand what the system is doing enough to make an informed decision on the abilities.
But they've also said that they want to allow you to make mistakes if you want. They're going to have the derived stats, which I think will do some of that work for us. It's going to tell us what your health is. It's going to take some of those other numbers and put them together and kind of give us the end result, right? So they'll have some of it there. Let's talk a little bit just real quick about the Banes and Boons, because some people may not know these are not just stat points, like not just more strength, but these are different things like, there's a whole list. There's hundreds of them based on your race and your class and your faction and your archetype and all these different things. And again, these are things that you can't change after you make your character. And this is part of character creation, and it kind of goes along with stats. Are you guys excited about Banes and Boons? I think it's one of the coolest systems to further customize your character and say, this is what I want to be. And you don't have to worry about 2 months down the road, everybody says, oh, I want to be that too, and they can just switch. Like, you got to stick with it. I really like this system.
Yeah, I love the Bane and Boon system. It really, for me, it heralds back to some of my background in Vampire the Masquerade, where they had merits and flaws. A lot of the White Wolf games had merits and flaws where you can go in and go, okay, I want these bonuses for my character. And a lot of them are really interesting, unique sort of attributes that allow you to have these special qualities that really made your characters really kind of cool. But then to compensate for that, you'd have to take on these flaws to, really further flesh out and develop and make your character very interesting. So I think it has a lot of possibilities for it.
Yeah. And the Banes and Boons, you get to pick these things, just in case you don't know, while we're talking about them here. Boons are good things for your character. So maybe they make you stronger, run faster, or maybe they make it so you take less damage while you're falling, or maybe you're less susceptible to a fear type spell, whatever. But to counteract that, so you can't just pick all the good things, you can see at the top of the screen here, the bar, it has to be even. So you need to be like 10 and 10. So to counteract all these good things you're picking, you got to pick some bad things too. Maybe you don't get healed as much by potions. Maybe fire damage does more damage to you. And again, these are one of those things you could really gimp your character, right? Like,
exactly. So it's a matter of the way we're going to have to work with that. At least from what I see, the way the system is now, is basically, we're going to have to really decide what we want to do with our character, what kind of playstyle we're going to have, what kind of stuff we're going to do in the game beforehand. And then you see what are the best booms for it. So what, I'm going to be a warrior. Am I going to be melee? Yes. Am I going to use heavy armor? Yes. What kind of weapons I'm going to use? Probably, spear and a shield. Okay, so one hand and shield. All right. So, do I need a lot of HP? Probably. But I also need strength so I can cause a lot of damage and dexterity so I can dodge and run fast and catch up to people and be mobile on the fight. All right, cool. So decided how I'm going to play. Now I'm going to see what Banes favor that play style. Helps, so movement speed, a little bit of more mass so you can carry more stuff, maybe a little more strength so you can start with a better weapon. There's one thing that increases your damage if you're using heavy armor. There's other thing that increases this or that. You just pick the booms. And then it's going to give you like 20 points of booms. And then you see the Banes that don't hurt your play style, and you pick them, right? Because, this Bane reduces my casting speed. Okay, cool. I'll pick this one, because I'm not casting anything. So, and then you just go and try to find the Banes that will harm you the least. So that's going to be a challenge, just to make all this work, but that's, that emphasizes choices matter. From the moment you create your character, you got to start with something that makes sense. You can't just go in there and make a character, like people doing these MMOs. They make a character, oh, I'm going to choose Hunter, and then I'm going to need on all this intellect gear because I don't know what I'm doing, Right. No, you just have to pay attention to what your class uses, what your weapons require, what your armor requires, and what the Booms and Banes do for that, right? Because it would be counterproductive to get one, increases damage, and then a Bane that reduces damage. I mean, you're just going to be, it's not going to go anywhere, right?
Do you think Velic people are going to get mad that, I mean, again, we're talking about a niche game for people who know what they're doing and they want to do research, but there's going to be those scenarios where people make a character, they've been playing it for a year, and then they realize, oh crap, I picked this Bane that I thought didn't matter. I thought it didn't matter about my cast time, but now that really screwed me. What do? You live with this horrible thing and work around it, or you make a new character? You can't just make a new character. It's not going to be quick like these other games. You're going to spend months and months and years on these
to
characters.
catch up.
Well,
Yeah,
I think there's two things for that. One, as I said it before, I think the hard part for them, besides balancing, is actually going to be that they need to give us enough information ahead of time so people can make informed decisions. Yes, they want to allow us to make mistakes, but there's a difference between allowing someone to try something crazy and make a mistake and not providing enough information so that people just blunder into a mistake. I mean, I think if people can go out there and do the work and find out about the things and then understand it and make sensible choices, we should be able to avoid most problems with that. Two, they did say that the game will probably have some degree of respecking. I'm sure they won't allow you to respec Banes and Boons, for instance, but maybe some of your other stats, you may be able to do a quest or something, I don't know, and gain some way to respec some of your attributes so they're not completely just off the wall and you completely have to make a new character.
What about like a one-time, hey, you got this far, whatever it is, you play this character 20 hours or 50 hours, or most games it would be like a level cap. But what about some point in the game where it says, hey, you've been able to play this character, maybe you didn't know what you were doing, here's like a one-time remake your character sort of thing.
And I don't have a problem with that. There could be like there could be like a grace period. Like, okay, you're in. So for the first week or two, you can go to this guy one time, only one time, and talk to this guy, and he will reset your stuff, and then you can kind of start again, right? Or he will reset one or two stats that you choose, or he will remove points from this stat and put on that other, whatever it is. But the thing is, the way that stats are going to level up in this game, it's by using them, right?
Yeah.
So if you realize that, oh, okay, I want to be an archer, and then you make a character, pick some Booms and Banes, you go into the game, you get a bow and some arrows, and you go try to shoot people. And then you realize that it's not fun, or that it's not really working the way you thought it was going to work. Okay, I'm just going to switch to a more melee spec. Now I'm going to get a sword, so you get a crafter to get a sword for you. You start using the sword, and then the strength starts going up. And then over time, they have talked about some form of decay, right? So they have talked about that very slowly. I don't know exactly how that's going to work, how slow or fast it's going to be. But eventually, stuff that you're not using is going to begin to decay. They want to make it so, they don't want to make it so like if you go away from the game for a year and then you come back, you're level 0, right? They don't want, so they said they're going to have systems in place to prevent that, so that if you want to stop playing the game for some time, you can click on something and say freeze, and then it doesn't go down, whatever it is.
Your character is so weak he can't move because he's like stuck in heavy armor, but he lost all of his muscles. So
exactly, and then you can't even get to a crafter to get a lighter armor.
You're stuck. Right. Your character's so stupid he doesn't know how to get out of the building. He's like, what am I doing?
The decay is so bad that now you decayed below your base stats,
right?
Below the base stats for humans.
He's like huddling in a corner, just pissing.
Yeah,
himself.
you're like Gollum, like
pretty much.
But
it's a good.
But
point,
there will be
though.
decay.
I mean, going into the decay and everything. It's a good point though that is a sort of respecking in and of itself within your own class anyway. I mean, if you make a really super strength focused fighter, and then you come back later and you're like, oh, I don't really like how this is playing. I kind of like to do a more dex based fighter. There's nothing to necessarily stop you at least primary attribute wise, from just starting to build your decks, and then your strength will decay over time if you're not using it, but your decks will build, so
Just
you end
take
up
some
going
time.
more, deck
Yeah,
fighting.
you're respecing. It's just not instant, right? So you're like, oh, I decided to use something else, and then you start using. It's like, what is the best bowl that I can use right now with my current dexterity? Oh, it's this one. All right, cool. So I'm gonna make one for me with this materials and this damage, blah blah blah, and I'll go and I'll keep using it, and over time, my base stat's gonna start increasing, and my strength that I had from using the sword before is gonna still be high, but then it's gonna start decreasing. And so it kind of balances it out. The whole thing of having your stats increasing as you use them, doesn't require an instant respect to be available.
Gives you a lot of freedom.
Yeah, it gives you a lot of freedom to just try a different thing within your class. Obviously, I mean, obviously you're not going to roll a warrior and then suddenly decide, oh, I don't like how this is playing. I think I'm going to pick up a staff and start casting spells. No, I mean, you're a warrior. You're not casting spells, right? Maybe limited melee spells, paladin style.
You're still stuck in your class, but maybe instead of being a strong fighter, you're maybe a quick dexterity one,
Yeah.
And again, we have to remember there's not this huge power curve like in other games where people who've been playing for 2 years, their character's going to be a little more advanced, but you can still jump in day one, because Marcus talked about over and over he doesn't want a high-level character to one-shot lobies, right? So if you decide you want to switch your character, you're not as good as you could have been if you had started that way to begin with, but you can do it and switch over and still compete and still play.
Be viable.
And be viable, absolutely. Let me ask you guys, we talked about a bunch of different stuff. What sort of final thoughts, what do you guys think leaving off here with the stat system? I'll just say I'm excited for Banes and Boons. I'm excited for all the numbers. I'm thankful I'm in a guild with a bunch of smart people that are going to figure it out for me. I'll just do it. I'll do what they say. I'm curious to see how respecking works, because people are going to freak out because everybody wants it to be easy. I think we're going to see a lot of crying about that. But overall, I love the system. I think it's one of the coolest things. Like we've been talking about, I can make a super strong warrior, and if I decide I don't want to play that way anymore, I don't have to remake a character. I can just start playing the way I want to, and it'll shift slowly but surely into the way I want to play. I think it's going to be great. What do you guys think, Velik? Go ahead.
I think the system is complex and simple at the same time. It's simple. It's simpler than other systems in some ways, and it's more complex in other ways. And I think it's a very well thought out system that could really pan out to be very strong for the game and really cool. I do think, like I said before, that they'll really have to work really hard to make the system understandable, make us able to understand the formulas and where the points come from, so that we can make decisions, when we first make our characters, and do so in an informed manner. I think most of all, I really love that items don't have any stat bonuses on it. I think that makes everything so much simpler and makes so much more sense. That's absolutely my favorite thing about it.
Yeah, I think, and I agree with that. The armor is going to have stats, but it's going to be stats related to what an armor would give you. So it gives you defense. It gives you, a damage reduction. Maybe, you have a magic armor that makes it easier to channel magic through that magic. So it gives you a bonus on casting time, maybe, but it's not going to give you more intelligence. It's going to give you maybe a little more resource to cast spell, a little more casting time speed. So all that is supposed to be in items, because we don't want items to be all the same, right? Otherwise, the crafters wouldn't have anything to do. And we talked about that on last episode. Crafters have to have things to do in this game. They're a vital part. So what is more exciting for me, to be honest, is the fact that it's complex enough and has enough variables. Obviously, it's unfinished. Like I said, a lot of those stats could end up being trimmed off to simplify the whole thing. But I think it's good when the game has a learning curve that is a little bit more steep, like EVE Online, for example, that requires people to actually do some research and and get into to understand, because that also helps building community. And I'm all about community. That's what I love, and that's what I think MMOs should be about. So going to that guy who plays the game for 6 months and asking him stuff has value.
Yeah.
because you can't just get everything from a guide, because the guides on the internet, they might, like Velik said, they might inform you about how the system works so that you can make informed decisions, but they won't tell you exactly what to do for what you want to do with your character. That only you know, only you determine what you want to do, how you want to play, what kind of skills you're going to use, right? So I'm excited because there is so much potential for different builds that, having that guru in your guild that you can go to and say, hey, man, I'm trying to build this. What do you recommend? I'm having problems with this. I'm not getting many points on that other stat when I play the game. What should I do to increase more strength? What should I do to increase more dexterity? And then that guy is going to tell you, oh, maybe you should try, crafting this or that weapon and using it more on the fight. It's going to help you improve this faster, blah, blah, blah. So, this kind of people coming together to help each other understand the system and make the best out of their characters is what excites me about the stat system, which is something that, in current MMOs, you just go in and then you have a, Death Knight class. And then you pick the Death Knight DPS set. That's it. You don't have to ask anybody. You just go to the vendor and you scroll through and it's like, okay, this is the DPS set. I'm getting all pieces of this, and that's it. The stats are already correct in the item. So I'm glad that this doesn't even exist in Camelot Unchained. And what does exist is taking the base that you made with the booms and banes and the primary stats, and then making something out of it, which requires actually thinking about it as you go. As you progress your character, you will see every morning, from the crazy progression system that we discussed on the other episode, you see every morning, okay, I got more strength. Now what? Can I use a better sword? So there's not going to be a frozen formula. That's what is cool.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe the coolest thing that we're all talking about is there's so many options. It gives you the option to do it wrong, but it also gives you the option to do it the way you want, right to you. Lots of long-term progression, lots of long-term stats and things and options, and we're tired of the dumbed-down, boring systems that are out there now. So this looks awesome. We can't wait to get more information on it. We'll be back again next week with a Veilcast episode number 5 every week, Saturday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Velik, Alistair, thank you for joining me. Everybody for watching. We'll see you next week.